You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to episode 143 of A Life in Ruins podcast, where we investigate the careers and research of those living a life in ruins. I'm your host, Carlton Gover, and today we are trying a new format for the show. It's just me today. No guests, just Carlton. David's not here. I think he's setting sail on Sea of Thieves, and Connor is doing Connor things in Wyoming somewhere. And I was really inspired by the Pseudo-Archaeology podcast hosted by Dr. Andrew Kinkella. I like his format where he just kind of sits there and talks to the audience for like 30 minutes. We're going to try to talk to you. I'm going to try to talk to you guys for an hour and see if this is something that you guys, our listeners, guys, gals, Apache attack helicopters, enjoy. So I wanted to talk to you, everybody, about three things here. And this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about peopling of the Americas. Then we're going to hit up the pre-Clovis versus Clovis debate. Then we're going to round this out with some overkill hypothesis, like what happened to the Pleistocene megafauna. So those are going to be our three topics today, because y'all listened to Connor and David the other day. Anytime I'm not on the show, they talk about things that they know get me wound up. And then we got some feedback because people were confused. So I'm just going to present what I think about peopling in the Americas, pre-Clovis versus Clovis, and overkill hypothesis, megafauna extinctions, right? So this is coming from a couple things, right? I have the same Paleo-Indian master's background that David and Connor have. Like, took the same classes, we went to the same department. I still do Paleo-Indian archaeology. I'm working on a Jones Miller, which is a Hell Gap aged bison butchering site out in Colorado. There's at least 200 bison antiquus. So I still have that going on, helping some folks up at Wyoming with the Colby mammoth kill. And so I'm still very much engaged in Paleo-Indian archaeology, even though it's not my main focus. It just keeps bringing me back. And then additionally, I've worked at the same sites Connor and David have. I haven't done Laprelle, but I've done Rock Shelter, and I worked at Hell Gap for 2 summers, and one of which is a crew chief. I'm very familiar with Paleo-Indian archaeology, and that was what I was hired to do at Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So even though focus on plains, towns, and the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic, I still have that deep background and appreciation for Paleo-Indian archaeology. And the reason why I kind of stay away from it is for some of these topics that we're going to hit into, some of the more pervasive themes that are just kind of still withheld within the field. So let's talk about peopling in the Americas first, okay? This really all stems from questions of antiquity of the earth, right? So we were talking about theory in these past couple episodes, and really during the age of enlightenment in the 19th century, like we said, we've had the Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. That's from 1830 to 1833, in which he demonstrates the principles of uniformitarian stratigraphy. And this determines the age of fossil remains by the stratum they occupy below the earth, meaning the stratum being the geologic layers, right? So the youngest fossils are above the oldest fossils in the dirt, right? We all know this. You think of a 3-layered cake. You have dinosaurs at the bottom. In the middle, you have Pleistocene megafauna. At the top, you have plastics and humans, right? That's just a very quick example. Then we also have Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, 1859. And this is the theory of natural selection, right? This isn't the theory of evolution. This is a component of evolution. It is the theory of natural selection. Charles Darwin doesn't mention the word evolution at all in the early editions of theory of natural selection, so he didn't coin the term. But around this same time, we have some fossil discoveries in the Somme Valley in Ménicourt, France. I don't speak French. I'm sorry. I have no idea what to tell you guys here. So, the Jacques, this is done by Jacques Boucher de Perth. I butchering the hell out of that name. But, we could either consider him an antiquarian or an amateur archaeologist, right? At this point in time, it's which term do you want to go with? I think for this instance, he does good enough work. We can call him an amateur archaeologist. He's French. He's working in the Somme. And he publishes the Antique Celtique. I have no idea it's Antique Celtique et Ante de Villeneuve. I have no idea. And what his book does in 1847, forget the French name of the book. He proposes the antiquity of people in Europe as far back as the Ice Age. And this is done from these excavations in the Somme Valley, in which they're finding bifaces, flakes, and the remains of extinct Pleistocene megafauna found in context with one another, which have butchering marks. So they find this discovery of, once again, Pleistocene megafauna. They're extinct. They're no longer around. And they're also finding stone tools like that are legit. We're not talking Saruta here. We're talking like legit bifaces. These are finished tools, no doubt about it. People made these in context with Pleistocene megafauna. Now, even though this book came out, it wasn't totally validated. It was validated when John Lubbock published his book Prehistoric Times, which is also what introduced the term Paleolithic into the literature. Okay, so we know at this time it's kind of becoming accepted. We have the principles of geology, which set up the order, the relative chronology of extinct animals. We have Charles Darwin with natural selection. We have these discoveries in the Psalm. Now, what about in the Americas? And that's, we've talked about it a little bit in the podcast already. I haven't been able to go on my full rant until now. You guys are listening to it. And this question of how long people live in the Americas has been asked since America's Europeans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere. So originally, right, they're going for the biblical interpretations, especially like in New England with those Protestants. And like we all have to remember, let's get this out. Like the people that settled New England, right? They're like radical extremists, like the Puritans. They were like kicked out of England to the Netherlands, to Belgium, maybe. Anyways, one of those principalities in between, or countries in between France and Germany. And they kicked them out. Like these are like radical religious extremists, which might explain some politics today. So when they show up, they are trying the biblical interpretations. Like they go with the Tower of Babel or Sons of Cain, which really comes later, like Lost Tribe of Israel. Like they're trying to figure this out. But then the 18th century, right, and the 19th century, really, we have the mound builder debate. And a lot of this, like how long have people been in Americas, wasn't really a thought process or thought exercise for legitimate, like scientific knowledge. It was really grounded in trying to figure out and mostly prove that the Native American Indians that colonists were running into were not the original inhabitants. They hadn't been here long enough. They're trying to justify colonialism and genocide, state-sanctioned genocide and cultural genocide. Like that's what they're trying to do here. So we have the mound builder debate. We know of the mounds, right? We're talking about these large earthworks. You find them in the Southeast, New England, Midwest, areas where there were early colonists, colonial invaders, and they're coming across these structures, which are fundamentally you can do by yourself and a couple buddies in buckets of dirt. And they're like, these are too advanced. Those savages today, they couldn't have built those. No. This is far beyond their intellectual capability to create these. And as we've talked about, right, Thomas Jefferson's slaves were able to figure this out. They, under TJ's watch, they excavated, what's the word for it? They just didn't dig in the mound willy-nilly. Like it was thought out excavation. Like it was methodological. Methodological, that was the word I was thinking of for. A methodological excavation. And they were able to see, using, relative chronology, these principles of geology, they were able to find like European goods in some of those mounds that were early on. And they're like, okay, this is definitely American Indians, right? However, so we know people have been here longer, but the problem with these mounds, right? Not really the problem. One thing that people aren't finding is a clear-cut association with American Indians and Pleistocene megafauna that we saw with the Psalm, right? So we know they haven't been here as long as the Pleistocene. That's what people were pushing it. And that's fine. It was fine with these early interpretations. Like, okay, we've been in Europe forever, since the Ice Age, but Indians couldn't have been here in the Ice Age because we can't find it. So like they haven't been here that long. So it's kind of fine that we're just, getting rid of them. Right. So they weren't totally upset by this. And this is all kind of moving into, manifest destiny. So all this is going on. However, things changed in the early 20th century with George McJunkin. We talked about on the podcast, former slave turned ranch foreman in New Mexico. He's, after a heavy rain, he's riding around on the ranch, comes to an arroyo, and is able, because he works with cattle. The guy knows his bones that go to bovids, notices that there are some rather large bones protruding out of the arroyo, and he rides back to town to tell his buddies. But back then, this ranch was huge. It was like a 2 to 3 day horse ride to get to the site of where George found these fossils, bones. Nobody wanted to go. Okay, but then like George dies in the early 1920s. And his buddies that he talked to, one of them had just bought an early automobile. And they were like, you know what? Let's go check out that place George was mentioning. And so like what used to be a 2 to 3 day horse ride was like a half a day car ride. So they just drive out there and they find it. Okay. And they're blown away. They end up getting a hold of the archaeologists from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Well, back then it was like the Denver History Museum, Natural History Museum, right? Whatever. They go out and that's where we find the like famous Folsom Point in between two Bison-Antiquus ribs. This is the smoking gun. We know that people have been here as long as the Ice Age. Okay, now it's confirmed. No doubt about it. Folsom Point, in between two ribs, like at the same level. You can find this picture. They even have it at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. It's in the Hall of Time, whatever the hell is the dinosaurs in it. They have a really bad anthropology part at the very end. But if you get to the end of that Hall of Time exhibit, you can see what we're talking about. I've seen the collections. They're absolutely phenomenal. I got to take a gander at Folsom when I worked at DMNS. And so now, and today, you know, the discovery is accredited to George. Even though George died, he was the one that found the site. I went had cars earlier. Now we know people have been in the United States or in North and South America, well, at least North America, as long as the 1920s. Yes, George McJunkin. God, and like this is February too. Wow, yeah. So I mean, go George. I'm trying to think because like I'm actually like looking up some slides. So Folsom at that time was believed to be the oldest, right? We know today that it's not. Can I tell you guys a story? I'm going to tell you guys a story that's related to Folsom. It was like my first week at CU Boulder. I was taking a ceramics class with Scott Ortman, and Devin Pettigrew has been on the podcast. He was in the class with me. And it's like day one. It's like syllabus day. And we're sitting there, and then like after the end of the syllabus lecture, Scott asks everyone's like, "Oh, do you guys have any questions?" And this is a ceramics class, mind you. And this like random undergraduate like stands up and he's like, "Yes, well, we have the opportunity to like research the oldest known projectile point, like Folsom points." And Scott was like, "No, this is a ceramics class, not a lithics class." And the student's like, "But why don't we get to study it?" And it was this really weird back and forth. And finally I was like, I stepped in. I was like, Folsom's not the oldest point, right? Like you've heard of Clovis. And the kid was just like, "What?" And I'm like, "Have you never heard of a Clovis point before? Like Clovis is older." And there's like a whole pre-Clovis debate. Like, and I mean, he was an undergrad, but it was like a really funny exchange. Anyways, so we know people have been here longer. And then after that, fun fact. So Folsom, we know, is at that time in the early 20th century was the oldest. And then we actually found the next one that had Clovis points in it. And this is a fun fact, is actually Dent. So there is the Dent Mammoth site. And it is next to the South Platte River in southeast Milliken, Colorado. It had Clovis points in it. And it was discovered before Blackwater Draw. The issue is it wasn't published first. That's the big one. So it is associated with mammoths, which we'll get into later. It's in Dent. So like technically Clovis should be called Dent, but the folks down at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, which also found, the same point typology in association with the kill, they were able to get it published. They got it out first. So that's why it's called Clovis and not Dent. And that's kind of that's one of the things of publish or perish, right? So yeah, that's a fun fact. The people in New Mexico got it out quicker. So another amazing discovery could have gone to Denver Museum of Nature and Science Archaeology, but they sat on that goose, or sat on that egg, not a goose. You don't sit on geese. You can sit on swans though. But one of the commonalities, right, both in Europe and in North America at this time, is in order to find the oldest sites, they're generally looking for Pleistocene megafauna. Okay, like those are the blinders. It's like we know we can find these archaeological components with these extinct megafauna, and we're going to get into that more in segment 3 when we talk about overkill hypothesis and the extinction of the megafauna. But I want you to save that thought, because on this next segment of episode 143, I'm going to talk to you guys about the pre-Clovis versus Clovis debate. So stay tuned and we'll be right back to hear my thoughts. All right, and we're back with episode 143 for another one of for this Carlton conversation we're all having. So, in the last segment, we talked about kind of setting the stage for people in the Americas. How long have people been in the Western Hemisphere? So now I want to get into this debate of really this pre-Clovis versus Clovis. Who is here first, or where did people come from? So kind of tying in the Clovis versus pre-Clovis and people in the Americas, right? And I'm going to wrap this up in the context of some of the 4 theories for peopling that we see. And this is tied into really, Clovis versus pre-Clovis, right? So we have 4 prevailing theories. We have the ice-free corridor or the Bering Land Bridge. There's 2. We have Solutrean, or the Atlantic migration. 3, we talked about this a bit, the maritime route or Kelp Highway hypothesis or Pacific culture route. And then the 4th one, we have the oceanic colonization or the Polynesian route. We're just going to go through these real quick, one by one. Now, so like the most prevailing theory that was held for the longest time of first, right? We're just discussing who came through which route first, not necessarily if these were possible later on. This is like we're the first people to ever come into the Western Hemisphere. Which way did they use, right? So one is the ice-free corridor of the Bering Land Bridge. Now, if you've ever seen like a picture of what bridge looked like, you should look it up because it's really not like a land bridge. It's a whole ass like connecting of the continent. Like it doubles, if not triples, the landmass in between Alaska and Russia. And remember, like Alaska is our biggest state. It is huge. So people wouldn't have known it's a bridge. Like they would have just thought they were crossing into more of Asia, right? Like it is massive. So people are coming in from Siberia predominantly because there are glaciers in Asia as well as North America, the Pleistocene ice sheet. The ice sheets do not block Western Alaska or like mid-Alaska. They follow some of the Aleutian Islands, Southeast Alaska, and into Canada. Like that's just kind of where the wall is. So you can go into Alaska, and people were there. So some of the earliest occupations we know of are in Alaska, but they're not in the continental North America yet. They're not on the interior. They're kind of stuck here. And this ice-free corridor, right, this was originally associated with Clovis culture, which is a culture that we've talked about, should have been called Dent. And these cultures early on, we should provide context. Clovis is dated right now from 13,300 to 12,850 BP before present, which translates to 11,300 to 10,850 BC, right? So we're talking about 13,000 years ago and 12,800 years ago. And these cultures that we talk about, Clovis, Folsom, these are all based on projectile point typology, not necessarily like real material culture. There's no pottery at this time. Paleo-Indian and Archaic. We separate time in archaeology based on these large groups. You have Paleo-Indian period, you have the Archaic period, woodland, and then pre-contact and stuff like that. And that basically like Paleo and Archaic is the equivalent of the Paleolithic. Woodland is the equivalent of the Mesolithic, and everything that comes after woodland is really the Neolithic. And these things change. They happen at different points in times in North and South America, right? Because it's not just like one sudden snap of the fingers and everything switches. There is genetic evidence that does show relationships between some contemporary Aboriginal populations and indigenous populations, no doubt about it. The issue is when did the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide ice sheet in Canada and the Cordilleran ice sheet in like Western Canada and Alaska separate in order to allow people to get in through Alaska, basically dumping them into the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains? Right. So this is where it would have opened them up into is the interior. It wasn't the West Coast. No, it dumps them into essentially Wyoming and they have free reign. We do know the ice-free corridor was indeed open 13,000 years ago. So right at the time Clovis could have come in. The issue though is when could have been supported life. The ice-free corridor, even though it could have been opened, it needed time for plants to, one, recolonize, and then also for animals to come in and have enough food to support the herbivores and the carnivores. So even though it was open, I mean, we're talking about a stretch of ice in between Alaska and Wyoming. That is a long way with Chevrolets to move yourself. So even though it's open, there still needs time for animals and plants to kind of utilize the area. Also, it's a hellhole in that ice-free corridor. There, it is loud. There's constantly ice breaking. It's wet. It's not the greatest environment. But we do know it's possible. People are definitely being dumped in there. And the genetic evidence does show, like, okay, there are some Siberian populations, but are they first? Well, we'll get into that. But the second, which we've talked about a bit on this podcast, well, we've kind of talked about all this stuff on the podcast before. I want to talk about Solutrean real quick. You know, Solutrean was really proposed by Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford. Dennis Stanford has sadly passed away. And this is the most bonkers theory, and it's not legit, but I want to cover it. And they propose that people sailed from central France and northern Spain, along the glacial maximum in the North Atlantic to eastern North America, And these sites predate the opening of the ice-free corridor. And they're saying Clovis points look like solution points. They don't. Their solution points aren't fluted. They don't look like Clovis. Additionally, like they're basing this off of like really 4 sites. Kenosha in Michigan. What's above Illinois? It's Michigan, right? Wisconsin. Wow, I'm bad with the Midwest states. Kenosha in Wisconsin, Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Cactus Hill in Virginia, and Topper in South Carolina. We've talked about these. Those components are highly, they don't have projectile point typologies. Their assemblages are really kind of sketchy. They have like weird broken rocks, but nothing absolutely, there's no smoking gun to those sites. And I've been to Meadowcroft. It's kind of bonkers. The problem with this theory is, one, people have had to sail there without any sort of landmass, without any sort of ability to support themselves on very, rudimentary boats. Additionally, the problems with this, the pre-Clovis sites, Meadowcroft, Topper, Cactus Hill, don't have any projectile points and a very small artifact assemblages. They're highly questionable. And there's no DNA evidence that we have so far to support any sort of mixing between indigenous populations here coming from Europe. Also, Solutrean points don't look like Clovis points, right? Solutrean points aren't fluted, and Solutrean culture predates the Clovis culture with a huge time gap. Like Solutrean is from 21,000 to 17,000 BP, and Clovis is from 13,300 to 1285 BP. So there is a 3,700 year time gap between those 2 points. They don't look similar. They're fucking bonkers. And the issue with this is why it needs to be squashed is Nazis, legit, Nazis love Solutrean because they're like, oh, archaeologists approved it. Europeans were here first and indigenous people wiped them out. So us coming back, this all ties back into colonialism and validifying the genocide of American Indians. It's just crap. I don't recommend you do this, but there's if you go to the White Pride Worldwide website, on their homepage, they have a tagline. It's called "It's Official. Whites were the first Americans." Second of all, people in Europe during this time in Solutrean weren't white. That's later, much later. These people, we all know they're not very intelligent to begin with, but Solutrean didn't happen. So yeah, that's it. You've heard it here, probably several times now. Solutrean's bullshit. Don't believe it. It didn't happen. There's nothing to support it. Third one, maritime route. This is the Kelp Highway or Pacific Coast hypothesis, right? This theory is people migrated from coastal East Asia into the west coast of the Americas via watercraft along an unglaciated coast, which existed, an unglaciated coast. And basically, they're just following seals and kelp. It is a highly rich, biodiverse marine ecosystem. People could have easily just sailed across it. And they weren't, they didn't have, they weren't sailing open ocean. They're just following the coastline. And archaeological sites along the West Coast have had robust artifact assemblages that predate the opening of the ice-free corridor and span across the West Coast of North and South America. And recent DNA analysis has shown genetic affiliation between sub-Siberian populations and indigenous groups into the Americas. Right, and the sites here we're talking about the Channel Islands, which are 13,000 years ago, Paisley Caves 14,000 years ago, and the Triquet Islands roughly 14,000 years ago. We also have Hueco Prieta at 15,000 to 1450. Quebrada Yaguay at 13,000, Quebrada Tequay in South America at 13,000, and then, Monteverde 14,500, right? So we have sites that have projectile points and robust artifact assemblages that are along the west coast of North and South America. They're earlier than Clovis. So, yeah, But there are some dubious things with it, but we'll get into that here in a bit as we round out this segment. Now, the fourth one. Now, the oceanic colonization, you might not have heard about this one. This is the Polynesian route, people coming in from Polynesian into South America. Now, there are, the theory that oceanic voyagers colonized South America. There is very, very, very little genetic evidence to suggest interaction between South American populations and Polynesians. However, this really seems to have occurred around AD 1150 or 850 years ago, well after the initial colonization. So it happened, but like much later in time. They still beat the Europeans, so it's kind of like a cool fact. It's like, well, Polynesians were also here. And then also, like, people forget that Inuit and like West Coast natives, and especially in Alaska, were interacting with people from Asia all the time. They were on the ass end of the Silk Road. We have Venetian beads in Alaskan context. Like, they were trading it with their relatives right across the channel. So that's a whole different thing. So Solutrean's bullshit. Oceanic isn't bullshit. It just happened much, much later. So we had the two main ones that we really got going for us, right? Ice-free corridor and maritime. It really, really looks like the first way people got here was maritime. And then people later came into the ice-free corridor. But number one is maritime. Now, how does this all fit into Clovis and pre-Clovis, right? Well, that's the big deal here is Clovis, to me, really seems to be associated with ice-free corridor. I think those people were definitely were equipped with Clovis typologies. And like Clovis was a really quick culture, right? Like those dates on Clovis, it's only like a couple, like maybe 400, 500 years old. Like it was quick. But the problem with these pre-Clovis sites or some of these maritime sites, it's like they might not have projectile point typologies associated with them. Some are kind of dubious. And this is where we're going to kind of get into with, well, who were the first people? What were they equipped with? Well, Clovis is definitely established. And the way that I think about this, the Clovis and pre-Clovis debate, to me, it's very much like, if we were to use a metaphor, it's kind of like the gun debates in the Americas, right? So you have two camps, pre-Clovis and Clovis. The Clovis people they're kind of like very much like the dope ban guns part of our government. They're all on the same page. No restrictions. Everyone's on the same page. Like, no background checks, whatever the hell it is, right? Like they're all in the same camp. The pre-Clovis people, even though they're all under this banner of pre-Clovis, they all disagree on how far back or what constitutes pre-Clovis, right? Similar to like what we see in the American political system, where you have people that do want to limit firearms, guns, but they all have different ideas of what they need to do. Some want background checks, some want, you know what I mean? So like, even though you have two camps, one camp is way more fractured and divided in what constitutes it. So it's harder for them to get on the same page. Whereas the other side, the Clovis firsters or the Clovis first mafia, they're all like, nope, Clovis was here first. Everything you guys have to say is bullshit. Where the people on the pre-Clovis side are like, well, this is way too old. This is not legit. My site's legit. That, you guys get what I'm saying. The pre-Clovis camp is way more divided, and it's really a bunch of subset camps. And some of these sites, right, they might still be Clovis, people carrying Clovis points, but we just haven't found the Clovis points. That's the other thing, is like, how old is really Clovis is still up for debate, because some of these sites we haven't found a Clovis point. We haven't found a point. We have like stone tools, butchering marks, whatever. We do have some good, robust artifact assemblages, but they're missing like a projectile point typology or like a finished stone tool product. So it could be Clovis. We don't know. The search continues. Monteverde, word out is that on the street from David, there's about to be a pretty good piece disproving Monteverde based on the geology. And I really didn't know this debate either, but apparently the guy that excavates Monteverde like guards it pretty heavily and doesn't want people looking at it. And that's a huge red flag to me. Paisley Caves is legit. I think that has like human poo in it. And like human poo is pretty good. Like, yeah, people were definitely here, right? The other issue with this coastal route, when the glaciers melted, sea levels rose. So a lot of those early sites that were on the West Coast are underwater. Makes it a lot, way more difficult to find them. Whereas like Clovis Point, like Clovis cultures, like they're in the interior of the United States, right? Like they're not really affected by rising sea levels, where that coastal route hypothesis, like that is super, like those sites are underwater. Like we even know of sites in the Mediterranean that are underwater, and those were only a couple thousand years ago, right? So like those sites, unless they're in high elevations that aren't like Monteverde in Chile, right? That's high up there. Like you got to do some climbing to get to it. So finding some of those sites, they might just be gone, but Clovis is really tied to the ice-free corridor, where pre-Clovis is kind of tied into this maritime route, and they're different populations, right? Like it's not just one group that came to the Americas. There was multiple migrations. How many people? Who the hell knows? Probably not a lot. And we're gonna get into that pretty heavily in this next segment. So and I very much believe people were here older than Clovis. You've heard us talk. So I don't believe in Cerruti. The White Sands footprints I'm still out on. The Chiquihita Caves thing we talked about, that's bullshit. I think people have been here older than Clovis, what we assume is like the start date of Clovis. Whether that is still Clovis, I don't know, because we don't know if those other sites were Clovis or had Clovis. And it's just, anyways, it's just a fucking projectile point typology. It's basically we're arguing over the kind of phone people had. For me, like this idea of like, what's the first artifact assemblage? I don't give a shit. It's like, how long have people been here for? And even that kind of point is moot. It's just a thought exercise for me. It's like, oh, how long were people here? Like, that's about it. Like the way people get so fucking bent out of shape over Clovis or pre-Clovis is fucking childish. Like at the end of the day, they're arguing over rocks. And a lot of these interpretations like are kind of meaningless. Like it's cool. Like I think it's just fun to know like how long people have been here. We know American Indians have been here for longer than 10,000 years. End of story. How long ago? Like I just want, where's the anthropology behind it? Like how did people get here? What kind of challenges, adversity they have to face? Like these are colonizing populations that are coming into a brand new world that hasn't seen apes, in a long time. There used to be Miocene primates in North and South America. They're gone. Those are the kind of things that I want to talk about. Not like, well, these people had the iPhone and then the people with the droid, they came later. Like it's fucking stupid at the end of the day, these arguments and how worked up people get is ridiculous and it gets childish. But I do want to talk about something that does have consequences. And so we're going to talk about Pleistocene megafauna extinctions here in a bit and kind of the routes that are going in there. So for me, I think people were definitely here earlier than what our latest dates of Clovis. So I think people have been here based on some of the sites longer than, 11,300 BCE. Whether they have Clovis points or not, I don't care, but people have been here longer. And the first people probably came through the coastal route based on the earliest sites. And the fact that even though the Beringia was open, it might have not been able to support life. So that's my 2 cents. We're going to be right back. I want to talk to you guys about the Pleistocene megafauna. So stay tuned. Okay. Welcome back to episode 143. We're going to finish this off with what happened to the big furry animals here in the Americas. And this, we have 2 prevailing theories. Pleistocene megafauna extinction. Pleistocene being the fancy word for the Ice Age. Megafauna is just a fancy word for animals that you can see with the naked eye from a distance. So like we're megafauna, elephants are megafauna. Pleistocene megafauna refers to Ice Age big ass animals that you can see at a distance. Right. So the Pleistocene epoch, epoch is a geological time, is typically defined as the time period that began around 2.6 million years ago and lasted until about 11,700 years ago. So like our human species, we're basically Ice Age animals through the course of our history. It's not until this last couple of years have we come out of the Ice Age and we're fucking up the planet. According, the most recent Ice Age occurred then as glaciers covered huge parts of the planet Earth. The term megafauna is especially associated with the Pleistocene megafauna. The land animals often larger than their extant counterparts, which are considered archetypical of the last Stone Age, such as mammoths, the majority of which in northern Eurasia, the Americas, and Australia have become extinct within the last 40,000 years. So just some examples. This is a list of animals that went extinct around the transition of the Pleistocene to the Holocene. And we live in the Holocene now. We've lost mammoths, mastodons. Mastodons are mammoth-like. They're shorter, smaller ears, also furry. Giant ground sloths, cave bears, short-faced bear, cave lions, dire wolves, bison antiguus, camels, horses. Now, I don't know about bison antiguus on that one, or technically camels. Like it's a whole thing because some of these animals just became a new species, whether they want to call it like evolution or whatever. They're different now, right? So like we still have horses, we still have bison, they're just not the same. Right. So this idea of what happened to the megafauna is just as old as the fucking pre-Clovis debate. And it's this huge debate across the globe. So if we ignore the pre-Clovis debate, the America's humans arrived here between 16,000 and 11,000 years ago. The Pleistocene ends around 10,000 years ago. Now, if you're a Clovis person, right, like Clovis was here first, right before the Pleistocene ends, and then roughly at the same time at 10,000 years ago, the megafauna went extinct in the Americas. Like, if humans get here in 11,000 years ago, you know, with Clovis, and then all of a sudden all the furry animals go away. This is what we call the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, or the fucking overkill hypothesis. They're like, oh, look at this. All the animals are gone. People just showed up. And they went fucking murder hoboing their way across North and South America, like just killing everything. That's what overkill is. It's this idea that people came in and just overhunted the shit out of 30 different species of giant ass animals. Not to mention all the animals that didn't go extinct. Right? You can. This is my bias because I find this idea just fucking stupid, and it drives me up the wall when we talk about it. Like people that believe in overkill, because it's a couple things here. Even if Clovis was first, how many people first colonized? It wasn't tens of thousands of people that came here in droves. That's insane. There are probably a couple hundred, a couple thousand across North and South America. Half the fucking globe. We're talking about a couple groups of small hunting and gathering groups of a couple dozen across the landscape going on a rampage and just killing everything in sight. No, that's insane. I don't buy that for a minute because it also, and we're going to get into this a little bit more. And the reason why I don't buy that, like, think of today. It's really these past 100 years that we've seen global mass extinctions caused by humans. The amount of people, technology, and time it takes to drive species into extinction. And a lot of the species we're wiping off as a species, as humans today, isn't even caused by hunting. It's like all the pollution that we're doing. So you're telling me 10,000 years ago, a couple hundred, couple thousand people that come into the Americas just decided to wipe out or overhunt the largest and most dangerous mammals? No. And the reason why, and this gets tied into Clovis is a big game hunting. Jesus Christ. It's just getting me all worked up. You can look at mammoths as calorie banks. If you kill one mammoth, then oh, look at all this, but they're super dangerous. Even hunting elephants and megafauna in Africa is still dangerous. Or you could hunt deer. Or you could do rabbits, or there's a bunch of other sources of protein that are less dangerous to your small group of people that you need, right? We're not going to find bunny kills because of the way the archaeological record works. If there was a bunny trap, rabbit bones are just so small, so ephemeral that the process of time will wipe them away. And this is kind of overkill. Clovis first gets tied in together because these kind of come as a package, right? Overkill works if Clovis is first and you have 800 years of people coming in wiping out the megafauna. Dude, the end of the Pleistocene into the Holocene is such a major climactic event. The driver behind it is the changing climate fundamentally. And this idea, well, it could be both. It's does every predatory species involved contributing to the downfall of these megafauna? Are they also responsible? It's kind of this ridiculous notion of the idea that people migrating into the North and South America are just overhunting the shit out of these animals that are highly dangerous, highly hard to kill. And this is also ignoring, you guys know our stance. Me, David, Connor participate in these things. Look at the episodes of Dr. Pettigrew. You could kill mammoths with atlatls tipped with Clovis points. That's fundamentally true. And Devin Pettigrew has a paper coming out soon that with the research that we've done with Donnie, myself, Connor, and others, that fundamentally proves it. Taking on Aaron et al.'s piece. So just ignore that. People definitely hunted these things. We have over 24 mammoth and mastodon kills. I'm not arguing with that. I'm arguing with the concept of overkill itself. And which goes into, Clovis people are specialized big game hunters. And this is what I want to talk about, sampling bias. And it's so prevalent in archaeology today. Dent, Folsom, Blackwater Draw, these early sites, you find them by finding big bones first and then the points. There is a sampling bias towards finding fossilized or bone, like of kill sites, because that's how you're able to find them. I would love to know the ratio of how many times archaeologists have gone out to a exposed mammoth remains, bison remains, to look for points and not finding them, right? We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the failures in archaeology. What we do know is you're more likely to find a point if you can find big game animals. That being said, we have over 24 Clovis-aged caches. And what a cache is are these amazing, beautiful stone tool point, basically drop boxes. They would put these in like hide, not bundles, but like hide wrappings and hide them so when people can come back. Like you can look at an amazing one, the Megafauna cache in Boulder, Colorado. The Fen cache is super famous as well. There are also these amazing caches. So we have over 24 mammoth and mastodon, big game animal kill sites, butchering sites that are found intentionally, right? Archaeologists are going out to look for big kills and then finding the points. All the caches are found by fucking accident because they were hidden in time. Like they are purposely hidden by people that place them. And so when they come back around, if they come back around, they have a readily available stone tool assemblage ready for them to go. Megafauna cache was found because Megafauna, the last name of the landowner, was doing landscaping in his garden in Boulder, Colorado, and they came across it. And most of the caches are found by accident. They've accidentally found purposely hidden resources, whereas big game kills, archaeologists are going out finding them. Once again, what's the percentage of archaeologists going out to look for points associated with big game? That happened at Wyoming when I was there. They found there was this huge fucking hubbub because they found an eroding mammoth coming out of somewhere in like January or February of middle Wyoming, and they rounded the archaeologists up to go excavate this fucking mammoth. And of course, there was no Clovis associated, there was no points associated with it, so it was paleontological and they wanted nothing to do with it. I want to know how many more cases are there like that where people where archaeologists are brought to a site that it's either paleontological or archaeological. They don't know yet. They excavate it, realize there's no points, and they just leave it. I want to know that percentage. And this is called sampling bias, right? Because we know that there's a likelihood you can find points associated with these things. And because archaeologists are going out to excavate big Pleistocene animal remains, they have it in their head, well, they must be big game hunters because this is where we find them. It's like, no, it's just easier to find. It's easier to find a giant mammoth skeleton than it is to find a projectile point that is like the length of your hand across the continents of North and South America. You guys understand what I'm talking about? This like goes into, there's an amazing example of sampling bias or survivorship bias is what it's called. What's more likely to survive? In World War II, 8th Army Air Corps was losing bombers left and right, bombing Germany. They were trying to figure out a way to make, like they were losing like a quarter of bombers every run. It was an obscene casualty rate. The planes that come back, the Army Air Corps general is like, well, we need to armor. We can't armor the entire plane or else it's not take off. So we need to identify where on the plane we need to up armor it. And so they were looking originally they look at the bombers, they looked at where all the bullet holes were, and they're like, well, we need to armor those areas because those are where the bullet holes are, right? But there was like substantial gaps in where you could see bullet holes on the returning planes. One was the 2 points in between the wings, between the engines, also in the tail of the fuselage. You'd see these large number of bullet holes like in the main cabin behind the pilots, parts of the tail, and then tips of the wings. So like, well, we need to armor those places. But one of the scientists that was working on this problem, he was a statistician that was employed by the Army Air Corps, was like, no, this is survivorship bias. You see the areas that, well, like all the planes that we're seeing that are coming back, they made it back and they got shot in these places. But look, all the planes that came back don't have bullet holes anywhere in these areas on the plane. There's these 2 points in the wings, this point in the fuselage between the tail and the main fuselage. That's where we need to armor it because the planes that are getting shot down, that's where the bullet holes are that's knocking them out of the sky, right? You guys get what I'm saying? Like he had to be like, wait. It's the inverse. The planes that are coming back with these bullet holes, they're fine. We need to armor the places where we don't see bullet holes because those are the planes that aren't coming back. And he was right. They armored the areas on the planes that didn't have bullet holes by the surviving planes, and then survivability of the bombers went up because they realized they needed to armor the areas on the planes that came back without bullet holes area. Like you guys get what I'm saying, right? And this is the same thing with archaeology, that for a long time, paleontology archaeologists, they're driven to go find big game sites because like that's where you can find points because that's the easiest place. Like it's much easier to find a bison kill or a mammoth kill than it is to find a Clovis age cache. So there's this survivorship or sampling bias in Paleo-Indian archaeology that drives people to look for the butchering sites, to look for the kill sites, because that's where you're more likely to, that's where you can find points. You don't find the campsites. They're super hard to find. And additionally, like, it's going to be super hard to find the remains of smaller animals like rabbits, birds, deer, things with much less dense bones that over 10,000 years get absolutely degraded in time. It's easy to find giant elephant bones, and they last a long time, right? Or like the bison drives. Like, do you know how many bison were driven off of cliffs or just murdered en masse? And even in the Archaic, early Holocene, but they're not the ones, they still survived. So really, by this point of this rant, and this is a rant, like the other two were more of a lecture, but this is just kind of like how bonkers some of these ideas like overkill is, especially how it's tied in with Clovis first. And if people were here longer than 11,000 years ago with some of these Clovis components, like that go up to like 16,000 years ago, then people were living in harmony, not necessarily in harmony, but they had like 5,000 years of living with Pleistocene megafauna, didn't drive them to extinction, right? So pre-Clovis generally like threatens not just Clovis first, but also overkill hypothesis. They're linked. You'll find many Clovis first archaeologists, they're also supportive of Clovis being big, specialized big game hunters, as well as overkill. Those are really tightly woven things, and pre-Clovis threatens that. And that's probably why the debate is also so fucking heated, is because this idea of how old people are, whether it's Clovis, pre-Clovis, if it is, and generally people are here longer than what we consider Clovis first, then it falls apart. The concepts and theories holding the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, and specialized big game hunters, that falls apart too. So that's the background behind these things, that these things are interwoven, especially when it comes to the Clovis first mafia. They're also the overkill mafia. They're also the big game hunter mafia. And they'll often point, there are these amazing structures that are in Ukraine and Russia along the Volga and Dnieper River where people built houses out of mammoths. And like, well, we know, then they'll point to those people and be like, well, they were specialized. Like, we know those were big game hunters because they made their fucking houses out of bones. Turns out the bones that used to create those structures, this was like a recent report these past couple of years, those people that were using those structures were looting mammoth graveyards. So if you guys have all seen Lion King, right? There's the elephant graveyard. Elephants do that. They have graveyards where they go and put the bones of their dead in, like these massive elephant graveyards. Mammoths did that too, apparently, and especially in Central Eurasia. And these ancestral Ukrainians or Eastern Europeans were going to these mammoth graveyards and pulling bones out and making their houses out of the dead relatives of these elephants. They weren't hunting them. Some were. I will say that. There definitely some have butchering marks. Now, whether they were hunted or scavenged, who the hell knows? But this idea that Clovis people were specialized big game hunters, like it's romantic. It's romanticized. We don't know if they're hunting other things. And they're more than likely, like, hunting elephants is fucking dangerous. It's much easier to hunt other things and get food sources from others. So like there's this bias in paleoarchaeology towards, well, they must have been killing big game. It's like, well, yeah, of course you think that because you're going out and specifically looking at kill site you're looking for mammoth bones and for this. Now, granted, there are a bunch of sites that are procurement sites, right? That's another thing. Like we know we're more than likely to find like Powers 2, Ochre Mine, and some of these places where people are mining rocks throughout time. Well, yeah, they have highly stratified components, not just Clovis and today, because like that's where you go to find lithic material for your rocks. Like, yeah, we know that. I mean, that's a really good, well, people need rocks. People need to make stone tools. Where are they going to find the stone from? Another example of sampling bias, but it's kind of right. Like rocks just don't appear out of nowhere. We know, like, okay, people are coming to these outcroppings through time. A lot of those sites, highly stratified, they're amazing because people throughout 10,000 years are going back to the same place to get stone because everyone knows where the stone's from. But, once again, overkill, I think, is just silly for a couple reasons, right? How many people does it take to do it? How many people actually arrived here to do that? The amount of animals, like tens of thousands of animals, people would have had to murder within 800 years is fucking insane. Second, people are probably here longer than Clovis, what we accept as Clovis. So people didn't just show up and murder everything. It wasn't like, here's this invasive species killing everything and the mammoths didn't know how to react. It's like, no, people have been here longer. They're probably not intensively hunting these animals. They're fucking dangerous. It's the climate. It's the change in climate. The Holocene changes, like bison becomes smaller and it becomes the world of bison very quickly. Bison love the prairie. That's when we start seeing the beginning of the prairie maximum. Mammoths, not so much. The main factor is climate. Humans aren't helping, but neither are the short-nosed bear. Like no predators ever help a herbivore during a time of a herbivore's crisis. Like, it's not just humans. There were other predators on the landscape. It wasn't like it was fucking the Garden of Eden here. Like, there was still predators. You know what I mean? It's just kind of silly, the idea to me of Clovis first, and that people that had Clovis points were specialized big game hunters. Like, what? No. Doubtful. People are way more varied than that. So that's my rant. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I really do find people in the Americas, these colonization theories, like overkill, like what happened to the Megafauna, fun to talk about. This is one of my favorite lectures. I hope you guys got something out of this. I enjoyed speaking to you guys. Let me know. Like, please email us if you liked this format. I'd be more than happy to kind of do these kind of podcasts in the future where I can just like lecture to the audience about what I think. I'm going to put some links down below, some things that you guys can read. And yeah, so please be sure to rate and review the podcast. I, of course, if given the chance again, would choose to live life in ruins. And until next time, everybody, we'll catch you again on Life in Ruins podcast. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to a Life in Ruins podcast.
You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at A Life in Ruins Podcast, and you can also email us at alifeinruinspodcast@gmail.com.
And remember, make sure to bring your archaeologists in from the cold and feed them beer.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.